There we go. Okay. And I'll just say that if you want more information, you can always email me, and my email's at the end. And all these photos are public domain and they're super high definition. We don't have time to talk about a lot of things, but I'm going to kind of illuminate what we're going to do. We're going to really briefly talk about native bees. Again, the talk is much more oriented towards planting, their interactions with native plants, and how to, shift things for native bees. It's not about anything more in general than planting and what gets done in terms of landscape and landscape management. So we'll talk about that. There'll be, because a lot of you are people who plant things and have yards, so we know about what should I be planting. And there's some generalities in terms of plant groups to think about. Won't be super specific because, there's a lot of things going on here. So you have 250 million years of coevolution in this area, and it's very detailed. It's not, we don't have to go to the Serengeti, we don't have to go to the Amazon. We have equally as detailed and interactive and complex a system here as elsewhere. So we're going to emphasize, general patterns and how to think about things rather than do exactly, 5 of these and 4 of those kinds of things. We're going to talk about bumblebees. We're doing a lot of bumblebee research in terms of what their proclivities are for plant use as an example of a generalist system rather than a specific system. We'll talk about specialist bees who are at the opposite end, who are really at times one-on-one with certain species of plants. We have 3 species of bees that are pickleweed specialists, for example. And then I want to take people back into a recent historical past, the Ice Age, and to think about what is this landscape here and how did it develop? What were the patterns that were created all the way back by super cold temperatures and also by indigenous cultures, and then also then about our colonial and recent history, and to think of, just get that the juices flowing on, well, what does this landscape want to be? And therefore, what should we be thinking about when we want to restore, recover, change our yard as a big picture goal? And then, again, things that you can do at the yard, but also at the municipal level, right? So your yard is good. You want that, first of all, it's supporting you in your backyard, but also municipal levels and interacting with county, city, state, and industry and the university, for example. They own a lot of land. Land equals opportunities, positive and negative for bees, and we'll bring that in. So in some cases, your impact is far greater by changing the mowing practices of a backfield at the university or the place you work than it would be in planting some interesting things that is good in your yard. So there's also, kind of proactive things to do with your local governments. And then I'll just talk about, because and we'll always do, about how we flip our pieces of property, because we're doing a lot of work now at our lab. This is our lab, which is has a sign on it, but is actually an old garage. But we love it. We prefer it that way because we can modify it. No one can complain because they gave us a tear down building. So there you go. So when we modify things that put holes in the wall, like, so what? Anyway, this is also an illustration of a direction to go, which is a lot of complexity, a lot of different kinds of plants, things packed together. Now, aesthetically, it may not be what you want to see in your front yard or the expectations of your HOA either. But there are plenty of areas in the back of the yard, and particularly, this is the kind of thing you want to do to segue between your whatever it might be, that's a natural habitat nearby into your yard, rather than planting a circular pollinator garden in the middle of your grass, right? So you want to have your yard be part of the surrounding environment. So a lot of complexity is a good thing, things in a row, not bad, that are native plants. But, this is the direction, because the animals then are not going to have that, oh, I need to cross the lawn to get there, or you're bringing in nature. You become part of nature rather than some, curated portion of nature that you said, I want this, but I don't want that. it really becomes self-fulfilling and you're expanding the opportunities for all kinds of plants and animals that way versus bringing in small numbers of plants. Also not bad, but it also is something that you want to kind of cycle in this landscape level thinking about what we're doing for bees. And when I say bees, many of you know Doug Ptolemy's work. He can be up here, he can say almost exactly the same thing, but he's going through that lens of moths and butterflies, Lepidoptera, and I'm going through the lens of bees, but the idea is the same. Now, he's going to use plants that bees really could care less about because they're only looking for pollen and nectar, really. And moths and butterflies often use things like grasses, which are, basically never used by bees. Okay, we also have to bring in the bee everyone knows, right? Absolutely everyone from, a 6-year-old up knows what a bee is. It is the world's worst model for thinking about our native species. It's, as most of you know, it's not native to the continent, but it also has a really, really different system. So hives, honey, comb, multi-ear queens, all of that. Anything you can think about that's a honeybee, which maybe the only thing you can think about in terms of bees needs to be wiped off your memory. It's a reset when you think about bees if your information pool, your Rolodex is full of honeybee facts. So, and I'll also point out that honeybees have lots of problems, and that's not what this talk is about. So those problems are severe but not critical. So honeybees are not going to go away. You can buy as many honeybees as you want right now. It's a lot more work to keep them up. But ecologically, honeybees have absolutely no place in the thinking and the working with nature if you're a nature-based natural system thing. So helping honeybees is helping honeybees. So if you're a honeybee keeper, that's what you need to do in order to support the honeybees that you decided to keep. Just like if you have pets, you need to do certain things for them, but ecologically those pets are not a contribution. So the same thing would be true for honeybees. They have a place, there's an agricultural angle there, but ecologically, and also just really mentally, we have to think about things very differently when we're talking about our native species. And so just again, some really small things. There are a lot of species, right? So bees have been here for millennia, and so have plants. All that evolution, all those flowers and all those sizes and shapes, and all those things that we really like to have in our nursery, in our garden societies and all that, that's designed mostly by bees, right? So it's the bee-plant interaction, 80% to 75% of all plants are pollinated by insects. And so most of those are bees. When you see big colorful flowers, basically that's a bee plant. But there's always exceptions, so we won't go down that rabbit hole. In Virginia, about 450 different species, about 300 species just in PG County where I live and work. No surprise there. And then every one of your yards has access to about 100 species. Now, that doesn't mean you have 100 species, because a lot of those bees will fly right over because you didn't have the kind of plants that they were looking for, but you put it in the right kind of native plants and they'll stop. And we'll talk about native, non-native plants and things like that. There's always the stinging issue. Again, honeybee thing. So no one is allergic to the native bee stings, even the bumblebees, which can hurt if you get stung by them, but it's not taking down your little garlic. Okay, so there'll be arguments for not putting in plants that attract bees because you're creating a sting issue. Also, no bees, including honeybees, are defend flowers. You can go wade right in there and move them away. You can get into bumblebee petting, which we don't have time for. Let's start a TikTok thing on that. But not a stinging issue. About 5% are cavity nesters. This is a little Hyriades bee. It nests in powder post beetle holes, right? Super small, little beautiful thing with all this architecture that we don't get to see because our eyes can't resolve what most bees are, which are about the size of a grain of rice or smaller. So you're surrounded by these small bees. It's not like, well, where are all the bumblebees? Bumblebees are present. They have their own issue again, and they're the most visible things. Honeybees would be next, but Most bees are really small and you're completely, basically, unless you're thinking about and looking for them, you're bypassing them. But they're incredibly abundant. Our back of the envelope estimates are 26,000 bees per acre are produced a year on average in the region. Most are actually ground nesters, okay? So, and so it's irritatingly difficult to find their nests. They're almost all solitary, and it's really difficult to figure out where they nest. So a lot of our information is very low on the natural history of these bees because we can't find them, right? You only make 6 trips in and out, and that's your opportunity. And then, so it's another, like one of these technical things we have to deal with, and leads to lack of understanding. Well, what's the best kind of ground for them? We wanted to do that. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. Many, actually all bees are picky, including honeybees. So if you're a honeybee keeper, you know that there are things that they prefer and things that they almost never occur on. So they're the most generalized of systems because they have to be. They're out all year round. They have to have food brought in all the time. So they can't be like, no, you know what, I only do roses of, you know, buttercup variety. No, they have to be like, okay, we're desperate, so we're going to gather, you know, food from oaks, which is like the worst possible thing. It's really a wind pollinated thing. But they'll do it to make, you know, make bank, so to speak, on their pollen and needs in that case. But all the other native species are much more restricted in terms of their Rolodex that they use. So we're moving towards one of the answers to what do I do, which is you need a big diversity of plants in your environment because different bees are supported by different kinds of plants. You can just plant clover and walk away. By the way, almost all clovers are not native, so we'll deal back to that in a second. So this is again, another one of these broad answers. When we talk about bee decline and we talk about, you know, what's going on with bees, it's really a habitat thing, right? See this building? At one point, you know, dial that historical thing back. This was great habitat. This was wild, this was native. There's a lot going on. It is zero. You zeroed out this building. And not just for the day, not just for the year, but pretty much forever, right? So now extrapolate. Now the sidewalk out there, where your parking lot is, your lawn, cornfields, many other things. When I came in here, I'm like, oh my God, this place has just been ripped to shreds. You know, it's all new highways, overpasses, and things that used to be woods or something else smoothed back at their lovely 15-degree angle for, you know, 500 feet. It's pretty much all gone in terms of actual habitat. So there's your big problem, is that we're using up their space. It's not some mystery that needs to be resolved, or we have to write a, you know, Washington Post article about it. It's just habitat, straight loss. And it involves all of us in a way. So another big way to think about this big picture is, how do I not develop the heck out of everything? How do I not put in that sidewalk? How do we restrict the number of parking spaces that we put in? How do we stop hardened environments? Because again, you're completely dropping that off the possible place of bees to nest in the future. Like it ratchets almost always only one way. Like like in the old days, if you were colonial or before that indigenous thing, we had to like dig in the ground to find rocks because everything would evolve and get moved in, and the whole life history of humans at the time was you're there for a while, and then you're gone, and your buildings fall back to the earth, and then the nature recovers. They don't really recover from the kind of buildings that we do. You don't have, like if you find an abandoned industrial area, it's an abandoned industrial area. It's not habitat again. It's habitat for weeds, different story, weird non-native bees show up. Yeah.
Has any research been done on the potential impact of the data centers in this county and other counties nearby?
Well, so if you build a data center, then whatever was there before the data center is gone. But so just my case in point, it was all wood and stuff. You've now zeroed out everything that's on there, like all that biodiversity, but other impacts, yeah, I don't know. But anything that simplifies the environment or provides hardened environment, or take something from a complex, mature, always, like, in particular, so you have different environments, right, that are not buildings. So cornfields and fields, a lot of this area has been in agriculture. But that agriculture does a severe amount of damage. It's not as irreplaceable or irreversible as clearing a place that had been woods for the millennia. Maybe it was logged, maybe you had cattle grazing on it, but that's created and preserved a lot of the diversity, maybe a little rough, but that's nature, right? Things get torn down, tornadoes come through, animals graze it, animals not. It's got recovery built in to that system, but once you like scrape it off, turn up the soil, like that soil alone is the holder of most of the capacity of that place. So the data center, in my mind, without knowing anymore, would be mostly like, well, what is going in to support it? What about the power lines coming in? What about the runoff? When you have all that hardened space, that water is going somewhere. What is going out, and what are they have to build ponds. Those ponds are not wetlands in the sense that you would go to a swamp. They're basically holes that hold water, and then you have to, I didn't really get into the stream washing thing by municipalities. So they're like, because I've been fighting certain developments, like, perhaps here, so they'll say, you know what, we're gonna take down these woods, but we're going to plant new ones. And it's like, this, I have to say, it's just total bullshit. It's like taking this complex system. My analogy is like, using methodology of art, and I'm like, I like that one by Raybert. You know what? I give him the same picture on my kid. It's like, what's the big deal? It's hard, there shouldn't be any problem here, but that's the level we're working at right now. With people. Yeah,
So you're saying, like here, they built this facility.
right.
If they tear this facility down and cart everything away, you can't turn that ground back into
Maybe
habitat?
in like 300, 400 years, it will be habitat. But remember, this place right here, the soils are now completely upended. It's probably mostly fill from somewhere else. And when you're looking at a forest soil, like when you dig down, you've got roots, you've got microorganisms, you have channels. That is a living organism filled with all kinds of complexity. Underneath is a subsoil which still has something, but it's intact from the top to the bottom. It's a natural progression. But that lawn out there will never be like it was originally, except after, literally hundreds of years.
So all of us as homeowners are pretty much screwed because all of our land has been upended. Bingo.
To
So then
some
what's the
extent,
point?
but like, let's say you're building a new house, right? Let's say I got some property, this is a great place, look at all these woods. And so there's different approaches, but the main approach would be like, well, I'm gonna put in all these pollinator gardens. No, your main approach is like, I'm gonna minimize what I'm tearing out of that land. I'm gonna put a house in there, like someone is. So you want that house to be minimally disturbing the native natural habitat, and then you're gonna caretake and curate the remaining areas so that invasives don't move in. You're gonna remove the deer as much as possible and these other kinds of things. That's your high value. The normal progression though is, I buy a lot, or developer X buys a lot, we're gonna scrape it because all the trees and everything are inconvenient and they're ugly. And look at the understory needs to be brushed out, and where am I gonna put my lawn? But that pretty much zeroes that place out. You can do like we did at the lab. That was also basically, trash landscape full of every invasive and turned over and things like that. So you can add value back, but it's not the same. And it would have been far better for us to have left that area as woodlands 350 years ago before it was turned into a tobacco plantation. So there are places in the area, and you can see that were never good enough for agriculture. Those are your high value remaining habitat, but if you scrape them down and then think like, no big deal, I'll put in a pollinator garden. Yes, you can have a positive impact, but mostly what you're going to be doing is working with what remnants are in the area. in terms of that. So I don't want to be too, I can be totally, Debbie Downer on the whole thing, but, you have to think that about what are the highest good in an area in terms of supporting the least common species of everything. So we're just using bees as our measure right now, right? So, but you could replace bees with moths and butterflies, with, leaf liners or whatever else. That all basically comes down to leave the natural areas. If it's a natural area, don't try and build it back up, right? It's not like, oh, I'm gonna tell them the Eiffel Tower and then, I'll work on it, to put it back up. These are in many ways not impossible to rebuild, but it's gonna be millennia, and you still have a very different soil structure now. So the ultimate outcome is gonna be something different. But nature does it too, right? In the glaciers, like all of New England was gone. There was nothing there, and it was completely scraped like we would with a developer, but even more so. And it recovered over 10,000, roughly 10,000 years. And it gets into all these philosophical things like, what does New England, what should New England look like? What should, Fairfax County be as a endpoint? And the answer, I'll bring up a couple other things if I ever get there. So anyway, that's in terms of goals for people, because people want set rules. I say, look, you have a piece of property. It's not like you can undo things from other environments or anything like that. So you have an environment already. Okay, I bought this house. They already did it, right? So not my fault, but you can start putting things back. So I tell people like, look, you should have on a piece of property, your lawn goal should be that there should be less than 20% of that property be lawn. We all can think of a million examples where it's way more than that, but this gives people like, how did I come up with 20%? I just made it up. But it's just a goal that says, do you really need to have lawn along the edge of your property where there's wood? The answer is no, just one mower deck for municipalities, like have your guys only mow the edge of the property where the lawn and the playing field goes up to the woods. No children are playing at the edge of that of the wood edge. It's not used space, but it's still mowed. Just mow that once a year, right? You still want to keep it open, and that's where all your biodiversity leakage is going to occur anyway. It has high positive impact without interfering really with the reason that there is a playing field there. So you can, that's a huge amount. When have a bee that's, the size of a Bringing Price, then one mower deck worth of habitat around, 50 acres is huge. So again, there's these little things. Think of all the highway controls things here too. So we talked about this basically, which is that when you think about what bees and other animals, anything you want, we know birds. So think about the birds of urban areas, crows, sparrows, starlings. It's not a big list. You're not getting tanagers in there, except when they snack through the buildings like this one did. That's generally not a great place for biodiversity. Bees are a little bit different because they're small, and I can give you examples of Joshua Droege nesting in the, outside of the American Indian Museum, and their clay sculptures. You can go next door to the Botanics garden, and there's, Megapile xylocopoides on the large helianthus that they're planting. I go to the Smithsonian and see Melissodes denticulatus that only goes to ironweed. They have ironweed. There's that, Melissodes and so forth. So you can have and create. So it's like, don't give up, right? So if you put more of that in, you're creating an urban system that is not a great bearer, but it can be a place that acts as stepping stones. These are not redlining any district. They come out if they can't find a plant nearby, they just fly. And so we see things like Poplar Island, which is a dredge spoil site in the middle of Chesapeake Bay, 2 miles from the nearest landscape. We, in 1 year, just sort of putting up some traps by Fish and Wildlife Service, 100 species of bees had colonized that island. They weren't there. They had to cross 2 miles to get there. So same thing, DC, Baltimore, your backyard. Bees are coursing all over the place. I've got some other good examples like our experiment on the parking lot at FedEx Field. which is the largest expanse of concrete. We would catch bees in the middle of it that can't live there, but we're flying across. So here's some, I'm gonna give you more general rules, because like I said, there's lots of details. We don't know a lot of them, but there's some practice, and also like your mind would explode with all that, like, oh, I can't make a decision, I know too much. Maybe the first one is, first of all, overriding all this is native plants should be the emphasis in any kind of landscape that you have control over because of all the relationships. So, you know, do I have zinnias? Yes, but I'll say like, well, zinnias occur in Mexico, so it's okay. The wild progenitor, but the reality is they're told why I like them, I put some in. And, so I'm not, just to say, I'm not an absolute purist, so I'm not gonna downgrade you if I drive by and go like, oh, I saw there's you know, Titonia there. So anyway, so native plant, and if it's got a big colorful flower, you pretty much can guess that that plant is supporting some kind of bee. The bees see color, moths are mostly white, but moths need to be supported too, but most of the system is driven by plant bee interactions, and there's all sorts of different ways they do it. Remember, they balkanize the whole place, so all this different size, shape, and color you'll see throughout this, and where you can think in your mind from, you know, from your print catalogs and from just being out in nature, there's the plants are telling you there's complexity. Why isn't everything look like a daisy and the same color as a daisy and come out the same time of year as a daisy? Because it's complicated. So rule in general, if it's got color, it's helping, right? And as a native plant, you should go ahead and think about planting that in there too, is that the more diversity of plants that you're planting into your environment, the more things you're going to be supporting. There is this sort of notion like, well, how many plants should I have? Like, is one plant going to really do much of anything? It's hard to say because that you may have one plant, but your neighbor may, you would hope, would have like 10 of them. And so bees are going to be working the whole area. So I wouldn't worry about too much about like having large plantings or small plantings, but a diversity of plants. And also that helps you by putting in the diversity. You now are running your farmer experiment. Like, oh, I was talking to someone earlier today, my ironweed is doing terrible. And what can I do? And I'm like, well, maybe it doesn't want to have ironweed right there or your yard. So if you plant a bunch, then they're going to self-edit by dying or being not. So we say like, all yard wants to be in these kinds of categories, and that's a good thing. So you can split your plants and do all the kinds of things that you normally would do. So, but anyway, that diversity is going to help the bees. You don't know the details, right? Because the details are all in scientific literature and there's scientific names of bees that you can remember that, but it's helping. And I'll show you a place where you can learn that if you want. But again, mediated through the plants that we know. So plants have different colors of flowers for a reason, and that's their different fruits are being signaled to use that flower. And in a few cases, you know, plants have multiple colors, but you know, if you're seeing that, you're probably looking at cultivars or something along those lines. But in general, each of these plants are almost always white, almost always, you know, violets of that species are almost always blue. Then there's yellow violets, there's white violets, which are doing something different, right? Otherwise, they'd all be blue. And so different colors, a good thing. You know, that means kind of automatically you're supporting a different set of plants. So shape is another aspect to floral bee interactions, right? Why are the vacciniums here bell-shaped? It's because they want bees. They're saying, you know, we don't want everybody to come to the picnic, right? But nectar is really expensive. It is. It's like a big part of their energy budget because they are changing a cheap product. Like think of pine. Pine just said like, we're not going to work with it. We're just going to throw out 1 million, billion, trillion pollen grains, and hopefully it lands on a receptive, you know, stamen or other part of another pine by accident. And that's why we're allergic to them because there's so much. Here, it's like, we're gonna wrap pollen with all kinds of fats, lipids, and proteins that our bees like, and then we're gonna put in some chemicals that are repellent to the other species and not even toxic to them. A lot of good stories about how that works. And, we're gonna work with a small system, and then we're gonna make it a little harder. We're gonna add poriferous, stamens so that in order to get the pollen out, it's not like an anther with like, here it is, just, take it off. We're going to have it so that you have to vibrate that flower at a certain frequency, so basically the pollen falls out. All kinds of stuff going on there, but shape is telling you something there in terms of what might come in, and architecturally you have these that fit, or their tone fits into those kinds of things there. So seasonality too, when we look at seasonality of flowers, we kind of know that, but these are spring flowers, this is our summer, this is our late fall thing, and, we're using that as guidelines in our planting architecture for our gardens, but the bees are responding for that too. So we think of, again, honeybees are out all the time. Bumblebees start in the spring and end in the fall, but almost nothing really is out there are exceptions, they're generalist bees, but most of the bees are out for a small window of time. If they're on the specialist end of the spectrum, they're out for basically a 7-week window, and that's it. In that 7-week window, their plant, with a group of dogwoods, for example, that's when they bloom. And then the rest of the year, all the babies are underground. They stay there until the next season when the Swida group of dogwoods are blooming and they come back out. So there's a lot of this kind of complexity. Again, the bee stuff is not very accessible, and particularly at a species level, which again, there's not really common names so much. But all you have to do is look at the plants, like you want stuff blooming in your garden anyway, from spring to fall. And so some of that is another measure without knowing anything to use in terms of like planting a garden that supports bees. Okay, so now let's talk about some different kinds of groups in here. A couple of things that we don't think of as much. We think of I think that what people think of is when we talk about pollinator plants, like here's my, coneflowers, and over here are my asters. But the reality is there's a lot more going on. So vines are neglected. Vines have a verticality to them. They have all kinds of architecture. Look at these two passion flower things here. What the heck's going on, right? Why would you design it? That's a terrible design for a flower, unless you're bringing in carpenter bees that come into a well of nectar in there, and you have these big anthers on top that are just dabbing them on the back, right? So that is basically the big passion flower is, or maypops is basically a carpenter bee plant. Some bumblebees will go in, but it's after carpenter bees, which people think of as all negative. And this one is in the same group, and it's got the same sort of design, but it's only about that big. And Passiflora lutea, I think. And then it's after its own highly specialized bee that is literally, again, the size of a grain of rice, and no one would ever see it. And we have a hard time finding it because we're at the northern edge of that plant's range. But the bee occurs just to the south of us here in Virginia. And so forth, here's a plant that's splitting between hummingbirds and bees. It's not all red, so bees don't see red, but hummingbirds are attracted to red. So when you see red flowers, they're usually tubular, and they're usually, unless they're, something brought in from somewhere else. And those are, going to be pollinated by hummingbirds, which is relatively in the east, a small set. We only have one species of hummingbird, but they're always splitting things like, oh, there's some yellow there. You look at trumpet creeper, you look at trumpet honeysuckle, there's a little bit of yellow in the middle. So they're, inviting very tiny bees that just crawl inside and crawl back out to, split the difference. Maybe you'll pollinate if the hummingbirds are having a hard time. And, these different peas, here's Epimea pandurata, lovely morning glory kind of thing. But that morning glory species, and I think one other, attracts a large bee about the size, almost as big as a bumblebee, but gray, and it only comes out very early in the morning when that species opens up. Cimolobus Epimea, of course you knew that. And then, so if you don't have that plant, then you don't have that bee. So there's a lot of these kinds of things. But anyway, vines add an element. And often they are providing things to certain species of bees that you won't get if you don't have viny things in there. You often have, you have places you can put probably or something like that, or even growing up trees. When you think in the, just as an aside, you know, a lot of this is associated, we associate with our invasives like Boston ivy and some of those things, which is, they don't do anything on the ground, but they climb up a tree and they bloom. The same thing is true of like poison ivy. It's like, what do you mean poison ivy? It's a great pollinator plant. There is a lot of bloom on it, but it has to grow up something before it blooms, because then it has to be attractive. So poison ivy is, only goal is, in addition to irritating you, is to find something to grow up on so it can bloom. Some exceptions to that, or a cliff. So Virginia creeper, on and on, things. Okay, so now a little break here. So we're thinking about things historically. So basically, right now, if we were to disappear, everything would turn to trees, with a couple exceptions. Wetlands, because the wetlands are not the greatest place for trees to establish, but some of those actually become trees too, they just swamps. Others, not so much, depends on the hydrology. But everything else, including our barrens, our shale barrens, our lovely barrens up in Maryland, and some in Virginia that are the what kind of the name of the soil type. Anyway, all these places that we think of as always open, sand barrens on the eastern shore, Ecological County and things like that, those would all be trees. Like, it takes a long time, but eventually, like it's sold to like, they have to keep knocking back the pine, because the pine is that first pioneer. It comes in and sheds some needles, those needles modify the structure, more pine come in, eventually it's all pine, right? So why do we have all these, so when we look at the list of bees, there's a lot that are open country. Well, we know now why that is, and that was because we made everything open, right? But that's not the natural proclivity of the region. Their natural proclivity is to become forest. You think, well, what about forest fires and lightning and stuff? It doesn't work here. It's too wet. So yes, every once in a while, a lightning strike will cause a forest fire. But not very often, and it doesn't extend even if you don't have everyone and their mother trying to put it out. Most of the forest fires that are damaging in the region are spring and fall, when there is essentially no lightning. They're human-caused things. It's easy to do. And you go to the south and you have a different system. So you go down to Florida, you have a million lightning strikes all throughout the summer. And there's a lot of crispy vegetation that is designed to burn over and over again in those environments. You move north and you still have that, and then it gradually becomes too wet. We're essentially too wet, but yet we can look at the environment, how it was when we look at pollen cores going back thousands of years. We know that just to the north in Pennsylvania were glaciers, that a lot of this region was taiga to near tundra in the ice age, but we still see all this pine and other things. And now we know that Indians settled in this area at least probably 15,000. And that's a conservative thing now. We used to say 10 and 13, but you know, Cactus Hill down in near South Petersburg has stuff going back to 18,000 years ago. Controversial formally, but not so much now. And there's lots of evidence that we probably can go well into 20,000 years ago. And that was their tool. Like, have you ever tried to chop down a tree with a stone axe? It's really not efficient. But you light a fire, which they're very good at, and that's what they did. They managed the landscape with fire. So essentially we had all kinds of open landscapes, and now we have to deal with that leftover. Like some of these landscapes we have to bring fire in because we stopped putting fire in. We know this general story, and it's kind of difficult to figure out, well, what does the land want to be? So it's a combination of things right now, because all these southern species after thousands of years have moved up that were associated with open landscapes, particularly on sand, all the stuff from the west that are prairie-like, they're like, hey, we can go in here. Is that? Do I have something?
You said 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. And then, I know I just go on and on. So anyway, so the thing I'm emphasizing here is we tend to put our pollinator eggs into the open basket. which is good. You know, there's a lot of things, a lot of uncommon things that need to be supported there, but don't neglect the woodlands. So we'll talk about this here as I rush through more of what I'm talking about. And so shrub wise, if we look at the list of shrubs, so now we're moving into three, you know, an X, Y, and Z component. So when we think of perennials, you know, we're down here and it's basically an X, Y. So it's like a flat plane of pollinator stuff. When you get a tree or you get a shrub, now all of a sudden, if you think about it, they're producing huge amounts of pollen and nectar, but we just generally don't think about it so much. So these are high productivity supporting many kinds of pollinators, things that you can add in naturally, accidentally. We have incorporated many of these into our landscapes as ornamental trees and shrubs. So complicated to talk about, but you want to look back on these lists and keep doing that, but make them into your native plants. So like your native azaleas have specialist bees that are on the native azaleas on there. Are they on the Himalayan ones? No, they are not. Do we have invasive bees that are on the Himalayan ones that are from Asia? Yes, we do. But button bush has a different scent, like there's this architecture going on. So some of the viburnums and this is Lyonia, very neglected plant. Ericaceous shrubs have a long list of bees that are associated only with certain ones. So there's 3 or 4 species of bees in the region that only go to Lyonia in that ericaceous suite. So I can talk forever about these things. Then we have trees. So it gets interesting because these sort of mid-story rosaceous trees. So pear, we have native analogs, crab apples, to Malus, the genus that are apples. But apples, trees, and a lot of our orchards are actually highly supportive of native bees. Why is that? It's because the rosaceous families, MO and Ilex too, is what I call party plants. They bloom for a very short period of time. A specialist plant is going to bloom for a long period of time so that they get connected to the bee. But the party plant, like a lot of cherry and apple, week and a half, that's all you get out of that. That's not good in terms of specializing for a bee, because if it's rainy or cold, then that can cycle through almost all its bloom. And if there was a bee trying desperately in 14 days or less to get enough pollen and nectar, it's just not enough time. So it doesn't work. But their MO is like, we're gonna bloom, we're gonna have very simple structure. We're not gonna put a lot of poison in there. We're saying like, everyone come and join the plant party. And they do. These will pack with everything in the neighborhood is gonna visit those plants for that short window and grab as much pollen and nectar as they can and leave, and that tree will be pollinated one way or the other. There's more complexity like with redbud. Look at that architecture. So when you plant your ornamentals, your street trees and things, having solid, non, cultivar things or less cultivar. So for example, if you have a double, any kind of flower, forget it. A lot of that doubling is basically destroying the pollen and nectar capabilities of that plant. And the plant has repositioned itself to produce that bloom, which it never does in nature, right? Nature's not full of double blossoms. When we force them to do that, that's the problem with cultivars, is the plant breeder becomes the evolutionary agent, not nature. And the plant breeder never goes like, I'm gonna design a plant that has great pollen and nectar for bees. No, they're asking you to do a million other things, and the plant is like, I'm gonna get that energy to make my flowers bigger, last longer, or shorter. It's like pollen and nectar. No one's asking us for that. We're taking it out of that bank and putting it in another. Okay, we're really going to maybe make it here. So general rules here, just some of this we've sort of talked about. Plant more blooming trees and shrubs into your edges. So I got a road down my driveway into the woods that I built my house in. So that's a break, sun comes in. My house, I've got a red maple I planted in the center of the yard 30 years ago, and now taking over the whole thing. There's still light coming in from the side. So these shady spots are still appropriate for many of the species that are more sun loving. There's also all the woodland plants. So a lot of your things like blueberries and the shrubby things like viburnums and so forth, and rhododendrons, they're designed to live in woods, but they really don't. They really suffer in the middle of the woods. They're waiting for a light break. So it's the edges. Like if I'm collecting bees, I don't hang out in the middle of a woods that has a completely closed canopy. There's almost nothing in there except for the vernal flush of spring wildflowers for that brief period of time, like spring beauties and wild oats and things like that. The rest, everything else is just waiting for some destructive event to get rid of those damn trees. And then they bloom. So the edges though are where the action is. So go in, remove the invasives and also love those edges and stick in your native plants along your roadsides and along the edges of your property. So deer are a problem, right? So deer, wouldn't it be great if they mostly ate invasive species? They don't. They grew up with native plants. That's their preferred food source. And they turn their noses up invasive species because that's what invasive species are good at. It wouldn't be an invasive species if they weren't distasteful to deer, right? It's part of that superpower that these invasives have. Bigger, better, faster, cheaper, you know, all that kind of thing going on. So however you want to think about that, controlling deer, whether through fencing or direct control, is useful. So spring vernals, like I mentioned, so in the proper kind of soil type and system, so you wouldn't do this, say, in oak hickory as much as you would in your maple beech forest. So think about bringing back those things like trillium and spring beauty and wild oats and these other kinds of plants that bloom, but don't do a good job of reinvading, right? So we're used to being in environments that were relatively stably full of trees, might get knocked down every once in a while, but they're in bottomlands and things like that. When you clear them, put them in agriculture, and then trees grow back, they're almost never there. It takes a long time for them to make their way. So you might think about your tree-like environments, bringing in, it's appropriate, but not too dry, bringing in and trialing out some of these spring plants, which have many species that are highly specialized in those systems. Let's see here. Ericaceous, though, shrubs are the jam in these dry, acidic soils. Oak, hickory, pine kinds of things, where there's a lot of in this area. Your ridge tops, all those kinds of places. That's where you want blueberry, vaccines, lyonium, rhododendrons, mountain laurel, many of which have highly specialized bees, but also don't just show up automatically. The weird one is Irish blueberry. I see that all the time, just randomly throughout almost any woods in the area. It does do it, but you could do more because everything, all those invasives are competing at the edges where they would do best. The native plants would do best too. So go in, grind out the invasives, chip down and plant back in some of your others. Showy big yellow composites in open fields is often a component that gets mowed out of our systems because they have to grow throughout the whole year before they bloom. So mowing schedules and things like that should be largely once a year. If you want it kept open, maybe once every 3 years, if you want a little more brambly, sumac-y component to in the winter. Early winter, because in the late winter, it's too wet sometimes for maintenance people to get in. You just brush hog it down. You don't have to do that really if you have a yearly mow because most mowers could can get in there. And replacing lawn, which we alluded to, I'm running out of time, so we'll go through here. We did a whole study with you can take a look at these. He says, hi, I don't have time to talk about our bumblebee study, but we have a whole huge thing here. And so this is just at the genus level. We have 650 plants that we evaluated, it turns out, and more data to come through Ask a Bumblebee from whom you may have participated in. We did have a bunch of folks in Northern Virginia. And anyway, here's the high visitation bumblebee plant. So if you want bumblebees, if they're generalists, so they're going to use a broader range of things, but they're still going to be picky. So quick look at that list. I can send this to you too. And we're going to bring back in these I wanted to talk about, but I don't have time, about the nuances here, they all have nuances, but here's moderately visited, okay? Now we're seeing things like the black-eyed Susans, which are often planted as pollinator plants, you know, bumblebees really don't really visit them hardly at all. And obedient plants are kind of a bumblebee-shaped plant, but they're competing with a million other things like the frost asters in the fall for bumblebees, so they tend to be less visited. But if you just had obedient plant, you would get a lot of bumblebee visitation. And nightshades are underrelated, so horse nettles, ugliest plant in the world, even I'm gonna say that. But it is, gets visitation very regularly at a lowish level for bumblebees. Partridge peas are on this list, but it probably should be on the other list. Because partridge pea visitation is early in the morning. So it produces its pollen, pollen, it's all pollen too. It produces pollen throughout the night, and in the morning, the pollen shop opens up, bumblebees hit it right away. And then by the time our bumblebee counters come out, it's not so attractive. Anyway, and these are interesting lists because these tend to get no visitation by bumblebees. Now, don't forget, just because they got no visitation by bumblebees means nothing about whether they're any good for other species of plants. So, for example, our loose-striped Lysimachia group has a set of bees that I encourage people to plant for that are specialized only on Lysimachias, our native Lysimachias, because they are using the oils, not the pollen and nectar so much, that they produce in there. And then things like dandelions, which everyone's like, oh, keep the dandelions in your lawn. But I'm doing a really good thing by having dandelions. Essentially, first of all, they're not native, so that's one mark against them. But they don't get any visitation hardly at all, like every once in a while. But really, even though they're ubiquitous, it gets very low. Wild carrot here, so your Queen Anne's lace, basically nothing. Other species visit it regularly. We have a bumblebee finder, and it allows you to, if you want just a bumblebee garden, you can put in all sorts of combinations here and get a list of plants and even planting dimensionality for that. Jared Fowler did that as he did this one. Here's a list. If you go to that website, and it's here for East, Central, and West, it's a list of species of bees, of course, in scientific names, because they don't have common names, and then the host groups, mostly just the genera of plants. So you can just look at these plants and go down this list. These would be priority because this list of bees here is almost that's where your uncommon in need of conservation species are. So the things that bumblebees are going to are usually not. But this list here of those plants, like willow, for example, has 8 species of bees in the region that go only to willow trees. So there's surprises everywhere. That's why I can talk forever, because there's really interesting things. So we talked about mowing issues where you can have an impact. I will point out that municipalities, this is a place to work with municipalities. So you go down along roads, and somewhere the Chamber of Commerce has said, we want those roads to look like our lawns. So everything is mowed all the time, but even if you mow it just twice a year, what are you mowing? You're mowing all the flowers, right? Plants build up, they're getting ready, they're mowed down. There might be a blooming plant there, but for a bee, it needs the bloom, not just the plant. So in general, that's the problem. Once a year, you could say mow the forefront, the verge, the absolute verge, so that a car could go over or whatever. You have a little meat strip there, but that area between there and the upper slope where the woods are, that should be like a once a year or once every 3-year thing. Saves plants, saves bees, saves gas, saves taxpayer money, all these kinds of things. The real irritating one is when they mow underneath the power line multiple times a year. It's like, yes, you can't have trees growing into the power lines for obvious reasons, but no, you don't need to mow it 5 times a year. And who's playing in those power lines? The power lines are some of the best habitat for plants, rare bees, swamps, other things, because usually they're siting power lines in the least populated, least used areas. So it's running through scrub, it's running through really nasty, not nasty, but, like, dry, rocky soil. And so a lot of the plants that formerly would have been much more common because you had the indigenous and then the colonial people just burning everything, and that would have created these open lands. Now it's the power lines. But if you herbicide them out every year, or you, which of course kills the whole plant, not just the tops, or you mow them multiple times, it's antithetical, when in reality, it could be a very positive thing. So, I mean, the Chamber of Commerce, you need to build that compromise between mowing for neat and tidy to, like, we want to present our, town of Fairfax in the most best way. We don't want a lot of that scrub, we want lawn. To the compromise of like, okay, but, you have woods, can you keep a little bit right at the wood's edge or whatever. So most bees nest in the ground, we don't have time to talk about it, but some open bare soil is actually a good thing. Piles of sand, piles of dirt are actually great nesting spots tucked away from where people can see them. Some bees nest in holes. Take a drill, 1/8, 2/3, 5/8 size drill bits. Just get them from the hardware store. Give your child a portable drill with those and say, this drill is good, and that's good. And, your fence post, your neighbor's fence post, edges of woods, I do my shed all over the place. No one notices, and it's full of weeds. If you don't get all uptight about cultivating and having to put in tubes and that kind of thing, just drill new holes each year or, some version of that. Also, you have fountain grass, or my campus, which you also shouldn't, or Phragmites, my minder is getting up now. Then you can bundle those up, cinch them every foot, take a handsaw, cut them. You now have 200 nests that they can choose from of different sizes and put them in cans and other things. I think I'm actually pretty close here. Here's my technique. I let that grow. Nothing grew very interestingly, so I weed whack the whole thing. Don't need to weed whack, is what we now determined. I got an arborist to drop off a ton of chip. I just buried everything, no cardboard, no newspaper, no turning over the side, nothing, just buried. And then I planted straight into it with, not seeds, of course, but with plants. And, it's been pretty much, I think I have this year's or whatever. It's not something that you have to deal with. Right, second to last one. So plants are working with many of the insect groups, so we don't have time, and a lot of them are obscure. So you wouldn't necessarily be going like, here, if I were saying, well, leaf miner plants in your garden for saving them, or tree hoppers and spittlebugs. Woo! Anyway, you're doing a lot with many other kinds of bees and wasps just coming to flowers and perching there. So you want this complex sort of yard of the future, and that's my information. I'm done.